Okay, so we left off last lecture talking about sustainability and corporate social responsibility. And one of the things that has really made organizations and multinational corporations care about this issue of social responsibility and sustainability are the presence and emergence of NGOs, that is, non governmental organizations. And so NGOs are not for profit organizations. They're usually nonprofit. They're not necessarily organizations that are trying to make any money other than to justify their own existence. And they're trying to do, their goals are about affecting things like social justice, politics, economic issues, environmental issues. And NGOs are basically, I'll show you some NGOs that you may have heard of: Save the Children, Oxfam, Greenpeace, World Wildlife Fund. All of these kind of nonprofit organizations that have a goal in mind, and their goal is to sort of change the way multinational corporations do business. And so NGOs have really made corporations responsive to needs by highlighting or shining a light on the things that multinational corporations do wrong, or in the views of some NGOs, things that they're not doing well enough. So NGOs have grown in number and in power and influence, and they're able to be big time activists that make the way corporations change the way they do business. And here's the main reason that I want you guys to know why that NGOs are so powerful. And it's in a nutshell, this sort of graph shows it. Basically, NGOs, non-governmental organizations like Oxfam or World Wildlife Fund or Greenpeace, are the most trusted organizations, and the leaders of those organizations are the most trusted leaders in the world. So when someone from Red Cross or someone from the World Wildlife Fund says something, when a leader says something to the public tends to believe it. And we look down here at the very bottom of this list, look who's the least trusted in the world, and that's leaders of the United States, not surprising. But then executives of multinational corporations. People don't believe CEOs when they say things. People don't think that they have good intentions, just like leaders of the USA. The rest of the world tends to think that leaders don't have good intentions. So because NGOs are so trusted, they're able to say things about multinational corporations and change the public's view of the way that they view that multinational corporation. A great example of that would be when Oxfam or World Wildlife Fund says that a company is polluting the earth, or that they are exploiting low-wage workers in other countries. So, for instance, the companies have looked at the way that Coca-Cola um, basically makes their product in other countries, and they've found that these NGOs have found that Coca-Cola pollutes um, developing countries by kind of not recycling and not doing away with all of the excess kind of pollutants that come from making Coca-Cola. And there are not laws in these other countries that, like we have the EPA here, there's not laws in other countries that make Coca-Cola have to do that. And so NGOs have shined a light on Coca-Cola in these other countries, and then Coca-Cola has voluntarily changed the way that they do business. So what we see is that things like other NGOs are able to change the way really powerful companies like Coca-Cola or Nike or Levi's or Chiquita or Timberland. I'll tell a story in class about Timberland. The way they do business, and then it's directly from NGOs. So as we think more broadly about ethics and social responsibility, one of the things that we discussed in class, but it is something that I want you to think about, is what do countries, developing countries, gain, and why do they work their workers so much and 12 hours a day, 7 days a week? Don't let them leave. For instance, this is a picture of a factory in China, and in this factory, workers are literally locked in. They can't leave. So that's part of what they sign up for when they want to work at a company like Foxconn, let's say, for instance. They're not allowed to leave. And so they are there for many, many months on end in conditions that really we can't imagine. And, the real question is, are we able to view, as Americans, able to view what China needs and what China wants from its workers through a prism that really gives us some, understanding. And I'm going to talk about in class, piracy and counterfeiting are also great examples of how thinking across cultures is very, very difficult. Because when you see workers that work for weeks and months on end, and they only have a couple of breaks per year to see their family, they actually travel hundreds of miles to go back to see their family and hand off money and to see them for Chinese New Year. It's just really difficult for us to understand. But the idea of piracy and counterfeiting that's so embedded in our culture, this idea of private property, it doesn't exist the same way in China. And it leads to Chinese being seen as violating a lot of consumer rights and business rights that we take for granted here in the United States. So what social responsibility means varies across different countries. Another way that we see social responsibility vary is through gift-giving culture. So Japanese and Chinese and many Asian countries are big-time gift-giving cultures. When they want to do business with you and when they meet you, they give you incredible gifts. A lot of times it's luxury products and things that are very expensive. And it's just so that they can possibly do business with you. And in the United States, if someone was to give us a really, really nice gift, like let's say an iPhone or a luxury purse, right upon meeting, we might say, well, this is a bribe. You want to do business with me, so you're giving me something, so that I'll say yes. In these cultures, that's not how they see it. It's a gift-giving culture, and you give gifts. So when you cross cultures, some really weird things start to happen and some ethical issues get brought up. Another thing, and we're going to talk about this later on in chapter 4, but another thing that happens with in Asian cultures, and Japan has seen this recently, is that to tell your boss that you've made a mistake or there is a mistake sort of reflects on them. So there is this issue with, especially with Japanese, systematically concealing complaints from supervisors. So low-level supervisors conceal complaints from middle management. Middle management conceal complaints from upper management. Upper management conceal complaints from the owners of the company or the major stakeholders or CEO. So bad news doesn't travel back up to protect the reputation and the face. We'll talk about face as a concept, what that is later on, of bosses and people who are higher up, supervisors who are higher up. And an example of this was this Toyota issue. Toyota had a problem a few years back where they installed brakes really poorly, and cars weren't braking, and they were running out of control, and a lot of cars were crashing all over the world that were Toyotas. And because Japanese workers at Toyota didn't want to tell their bosses and ultimately tell Mr. Toyota, who's actually the CEO, the owner of the company, his grandfather started it, they didn't want to embarrass him and let him know about the bad news. So he didn't hear about it for months and months and months. So there's a systematic concealment that goes on to protect people's reputation. That's also an ethical issue that it's very difficult for Westerners to understand. One more issue with Japan, even though they're a very developed economy, the third biggest in the world, another issue that sort of is an ethical issue is gender equality, men and women in the workplace. Basically, in Japan, men and women have two completely different routes that they take. Women take a women-only route, men take a men-only route, and basically traditional um, male and female roles are expected to occur not just at the home, but in the workplace. So um, not only are women and men treated differently and promoted differently, but an issue of sexual harassment is completely different. Um, Japanese don't see sexual harassment the same way that Americans do. It's They see it as okay to treat women in a way that we've sort of moved way past. And again, this is mainly an ethical issue because we do a lot of business with Japanese, and so there's a bunch of companies over here that make Japanese cars and sell Japanese cars and interact with Japanese. So when Japanese come over here, if they treat women like they treat them in Japan, they're in for major legal trouble. So that's also an issue that we want to think about. All right. Um, Shifting gears here to how corporations respond to allegations of uh, responsibility or that they've run afoul of some sort of ethics. And the way that corporations do that is they do that through their corporate governance. And so basically, corporate governance is about how a corporation responds to uh, their mission, their goals, and social obligations that they have. Right? So it's how the rights are distributed, it's who the major stakeholders are, and corporate government sets out how people make objectives and then how they go after those objectives, and then how you kind of monitor whether those performance goals are being achieved. And we sort of think about this in the United States as board of directors, you may see. But corporate governance also goes to the stakeholders, the owners of the corporation, and we know that those are stockholders often too. So it's not just employees, not just a board of governors, it's the also people who own the stock. Now, two major ways that corporate governance basically is enacted that I want you guys to know about is an insider and outsider system. Okay, Europe and most of the rest of the world uses what's called an insider system, and that is when most of the ownership of the company is concentrated by a single person or single family or single conglomerate. So basically, they're gigantic companies, and one person or one family owns most of it. So we could think of Samsung as such a company, or we could think of Zara, the Spanish shopping brand, where the owner of that company is one of the top 10 richest people in the world, worth about $30 billion. Or IKEA. Those companies are all owned basically by one person or one family or one conglomerate. And even though stock is sold, you can own pieces of that company. You can own only about 20% of the company or 30% of the company is distributed to the rest of the world through stock. Okay, now that's an insider system. In the United States, in the UK, we see something completely different. We see outsider systems. And that's where ownership is dispersed in a much different degree. And there's a large number of outside investors. And basically people who found the company or who are major CEOs or whose family owns the company, they're still minority stakeholders. They may be the largest shareholder, but they still own just a small amount of the stock. So for instance, Mark Zuckerberg founded Facebook. He's the CEO of Facebook. No one owns more Facebook stock than Mark Zuckerberg, but he doesn't own anywhere near 50%. In fact, I think it's somewhere closer to 15% or 20% that Mark Zuckerberg owns of Facebook. So if he starts performing really poorly, there's 80% of the stock owned by other people who can vote him out. That's the outsider system. The insider system doesn't work like that. If Mr. Toyota starts performing really poorly for Toyota car company, there's not enough stockholders to vote him out. He still owns 60, 70% of the company. So that's the issue there with insider and outsider systems. And it makes this outsider system a much better investment for people that are looking to invest in corporations. And now, one last thing that I want to talk about as we're talking about ethics and social responsibility is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, this is a really interesting act that the United States government, the Congress and President signed into law in this late 70s, basically outlawing anyone who's a U.S. citizen or a corporation in the United States from paying a bribe or giving gifts in exchange for being able to do business in another country. Okay. At first, this made American companies really mad because they said, "Hey, in order to do business in, let's say, Panama, we need to be able to bribe local officials, or we need to be able to pay fees, consulting fees, where they weren't really doing anything, but millions of dollars to local officials so that we can win their business." And what the U.S. government said was, "No, we are going to put you in jail if you're an American citizen or you're a corporation. We're going to put you in jail if you pay a bribe in another country." Doesn't matter that it's not in the U.S. It is illegal for U.S. firms and employees to influence foreign officials in any way by giving them gifts, giving them money, giving them anything, political contributions, anything, in exchange for doing business in that country or with a company in that country. And what we've seen is some pretty amazing things since that FCPA passed. Basically, we've seen corruption go down a ton in other countries. And the reason that we've seen this is because the United States, people want to do business with the United States. We're the leader in sort of in foreign direct investment around the world. And when we don't bribe, that makes it unlikely that other countries are going to be able to bribe too, because they're not going to be able to bribe for nearly as much because they don't have as much money. Now, the second point about why we've seen corruption go down is because this is kind of a logical a viewpoint of that. When someone in another country takes a bribe in exchange for doing business, they're not a good person. They're unethical. They're corrupt. And by continuing to give them money through bribes, you're keeping them in office or keeping them in power. And so when you tighten that nozzle there and you stop the money from coming in, they lose their ability to stay in power because they're not getting all those millions or tens of millions of dollars. And so by making bribery illegal in other countries, you kind of eliminate corrupt people from wanting to have those positions. So it's kind of a hit from both sides, kind of a two-way street there that eliminates that. Okay, so we'll stop there with chapter 3.